Welcome to Unlocking Nature. This is the space or the virtual campfire where we tell the African conservation story or the many stories of African conservation. My name is Johan. I will be your host tonight together with my co-host Kirsten. And I would like to ask my colleague, Dr. Kirsten Necke, to recap the preceding episodes before we proceed to tonight's speakers. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Johan. Thank you very, very much. As you heard from Johan, all 4 of the previous sessions are available on our website. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview. So in our first session, Dr. Rob Gildemont set the scene for us, explaining the dynamics of elephant populations against the backdrop of a mostly fragmented conservation landscape in Southern Africa. His colleague, Dr. Bernard Coetzee, explored the management issues in insular populations by comparing the populations of Kibale National Park in Uganda and Madikwe in South Africa. It was proposed that where areas are both protected and connected, births, deaths, immigration, and emigration can balance and stabilize numbers. In session 2, Dr. Sam Ferreira concluded that the management of elephants should be site-specific, with elephants concentrating at certain localities and not in others. He looked at how we can manage this within the context of biodiversity management goals. Dr. Janetta Cilliers explored the regional and national goals and strategy for elephant management, introducing the concept of the meta-population. In session 3, Dr. Audrey Delsink explained why and how immunocontraceptives are used for elephant population management. Grant Fowles discussed how human-elephant conflict influences conservation decisions. They propose that the best way to manage elephant numbers and reduce conflict is to use humane, reversible methods such as immunocontraception, together with better reserve connectivity. And last week's session, session 4, Ian Rushworth proposed that as elephant populations rise in increasingly fenced-in and climate-stressed landscapes, conservationists face a difficult ethical dilemma. Is it ever more humane to cull than to let elephants live? This talk shifts the focus from individual and immediate suffering to the collective intergenerational welfare of elephant populations, ecosystems, and human communities. Thank you, Johan.
Thank you, Kirsten. And now I would like to introduce our guest experts tonight. Dr. Russell Taylor was, among other things, the Transboundary Conservation Planning Advisor for the World Wildlife Fund in Namibia. That means he was the Chief Elephant Immigration Officer for quite some time. Dr. Nyambe is the Executive Director of the KAZA Secretariat currently, and from what we've learned from him, he is a true gentleman and a scholar with a fine sense of humor, which you certainly need in this position. Thank you to both of you. I'm going to stop sharing and the screen is yours.
Colleagues, good evening, and thank you very much for having us on this very important platform. We do not take the invitation lightly. We really very much appreciate. And for the purpose of those that may not be aware of KAZA, we thought that we should say a little bit about Kavango Zambe's Transfrontier Conservation Area, and also reflect within the context of KAZA on some of the work happening and some lessons and experiences that we've gained from working in this landscape, but also focusing quite a lot on connectivity, barriers to connectivity, and also positioning KAZA as a socio-ecological landscape. What lessons emerge from this reality and space we are working in, and of course, also what lessons we can share with yourselves. For context purposes, really, just to mention that KAZA is this large landscape that you see in the middle of the map. It accounts for about 60% of the transfrontier conservation areas that you find in the SADC region. And in many ways, that gives you a sense of the scale of ambition and also the courage to commit to a vision by the 5 partner states that established this Transfrontier Conservation Area by way of a treaty in 2011. KAZA is a coexistence landscape, and with a population of about human population of 3 million, 19 national parks, which parks require a lot of connectivity in order to give wildlife a chance to persist in the world. But we are also talking about a landscape which is largely 70% associated with conservation and wildlife. So this is quite critical in the sense that land use is changing. What does this present in terms of the welfare and persistence of elephants in the landscape? KAZA was established based on the vision that you are seeing. Key point I would like to mention, colleagues, is the emphasis on sustainable development, and also to mention that to work with 5 partner states is not easy, and bringing other players into the picture. So the mission of KAZA is quite clear, and its emphasis is on harmonization of policies, strategies, and practices. I've tried to summarize the 11 objectives, as you can see, ranging from conservation and the promotion of connectivity, infrastructure, all the way up to mainstreaming environmental and social issues, including climate change. In thinking about the work that we do in KAZA, one of the key points that comes to mind is principles of conservation biology. And I think it is only fair and right that we share these principles. Diversity should be preserved. What happens in the context of extinctions and what we need to do to prevent such extinctions. Ecological complexity should be maintained. That's another principle. And evolution should continue. And of course, biodiversity has intrinsic value. When we think of the treaty that was signed in 2011 and extract some of the specific objectives in the verbatim, we would like to focus on the 3: the maintenance and management of shared natural and cultural heritage resources and biodiversity of the KAZA TFCA to support healthy and viable populations of wildlife species. I'm not going to read the other 2, but the point that I really want to make is you will see the importance of connectivity and migration and the need for us to advocate and promote land use planning that supports coexistence and connectivity. And of course, research, fundamental, applied, and multidisciplinary, very key. As we do all this, it also becomes very critical that we think of the interface between policy, science, and management. And here in KAZA, of course, home to the largest elephant population, the savanna elephant population, and other large mammals, carnivores, and other globally significant wildlife species, we are coming across different examples of what we need to be doing in order to work at the interface of policy, science, and management. And these include, specifically in relation to elephants, elephant movement and connectivity, and identification of corridors allowing transboundary migrations, and also working towards understanding constraints and opportunities to connectivity as a result of a number of factors, but particularly the challenge of geographic-based approaches using veterinary cordon fences to control disease, and engaging with other players in this space in terms of emerging ways of thinking in terms of policy and also management, and of course linkages to the private sector and value chains. Then we'll also share with you some reflections on the KAZA-wide aerial elephant survey, and also the fact that this survey covered other large herbivores across the landscape is particularly important, and the result of which is quite some unparalleled understanding of the abundance distribution of elephants, as well as the carcass ratios as it were. Now, when we're talking connectivity in KAZA, this is a very important subject matter. What you're seeing here is an organogram of KAZA, and you have the ministerial committee right up to the KAZA secretariat at the bottom. But what I wanted to demonstrate, when we're talking about connectivity, we talk about connectivity from different lenses. All these structures that you are seeing in yellow now, the conservation working group and all the sub-working groups, animal health, elephants, birds, carnivores, forestry, and freshwater, they talk about connectivity from different angles. You cannot talk about tourism, transboundary tourism, without reflecting on the challenges and opportunities of connectivity. Safety and security, addressing issues of poaching, and of course, impact monitoring. We are working at scale. How can we address all these? And really just to stress that connectivity is quite central to our work. Now, this brings me to the point on the KAZA Elephant Action Plan 2025 to 2030, which was informed by large by the 2019 Strategic Planning Framework for the Conservation and Management of Elephants, which articulated strategic objectives and also strategic approaches. The elephant survey that we are going to talk about in detail is one of the strategic interventions that was identified in this action plan of 2019. And then, of course, just to mention that the action plan for 2025 to 2030 has some actions which are basically specific initiatives or tasks that we need to implement. And we've got a traffic light system that will help us improve on our implementation and also tracking of action and impacts.
Thank you, Nyambi. So good evening, everyone. I'm now going to take you through a session on the work we've been doing on connectivity, specifically related to elephant movement, and how we've worked at identifying corridors to allow transboundary movement of elephants across boundaries and indeed within the countries themselves leading to the other countries. And you'll be very familiar with a lot of the things we do, but let us just go through what is landscape connectivity. It's the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes animal movement. Connectivity studies endeavor to evaluate barriers to movement, identify key corridors for movement, and assess which habitat patches or protected areas are more connected than others. And we try in this process to quantify landscape resistance and/or permeability, in this case, as far as elephants are concerned. I'm going to take you through some of the things we've been doing. Why is landscape connectivity important for elephants in KAZA? First of all, as Nyambi's already mentioned, we have a globally significant elephant population and the range that it covers. Secondly, long-term viability of that population is dependent upon securing landscape connectivity between protected areas in particular, and identifying corridors between core habitats, and making sure that we can maintain them so that elephants continue to play a role in human-occupied space between these protected areas. And you might ask why, but I think we'll come to that as we move on. Habitat connectivity demands addressing human-elephant conflict, conflicting land uses, and the illegal killing of elephants. It can facilitate the movement of elephants from areas of high density to areas of low density, something that's particularly pertinent right now in the KAZA landscape, and in fact more widely in Southern Africa, as we've already heard from earlier presentations. That's just another map to show you the landscape we're working across, the protected areas versus the non-protected areas, the human-occupied space between them, and the lesser status of some protected areas like conservancies and safari areas in Zimbabwe, for example. So they're not, it's a mosaic of land uses within which we wish to see these elephants being able to move relatively uninterruptedly. And my final slide here, which we'll see again, is from our recent aerial survey, where you can see elephant numbers in blue there, distribution of those elephants in relation to human settlement in red, and livestock numbers in black dots. And you will see a growing separation between these three elements of the landscape, which I will return to. So on to some actual practical work, identifying corridors, allowing these migrations. First and foremost, we have an KAZA elephant sub-working group, which is part of the conservation working group in that schematic that Nyambi showed you earlier on. And this is a specific working group that looks at elephant movement and connectivity and other things as well relating to elephants. And that's all in the action plan that he referred to. It comprises country technical specialists and researchers and NGO conservation scientists. They deploy satellite VHF collared elephants and understand better their spatial and temporal deployment through the data that's collected and analyzed from those collars. It's a collaborative effort, and it also involves community identification of micro corridors. So this is a process that's been going on incrementally for the past 10 to 12 years and continues. Just to give you some examples of what has been happening. And when you look at these slides, I want you to appreciate that we're showing you some data that is informing policy and management, but also reflected in good science, and we endeavor wherever possible to publish this work in peer-reviewed journals, and you'll see on the slides examples of some of those publications just to demonstrate the linkages between the science, the policy, and the management. And here we see least cost pathways for elephant reflected in electrical circuit theory, the hot bright areas showing you where you've got linkages and where they are broken up, not so good a connectivity. And you can see that in the smaller diagram, corridors that we've been identifying from this kind of work. Likewise, from something like over 300 GPS collared elephants since 2010 to the present, we've got a series of results that are reflected there. I won't go into all the detail, but it shows in the first one, red collared males and blue collared females, green and yellow higher use areas in the landscape, and then the movement of elephants indicative of corridors. And that reflects movements to and from water along fences at the B, if you can see the B there, pinch points to avoid arable areas, and one corridor in particular, which is a very promising one, the Sobi corridor, which links Botswana through Namibia into Zambia and Angola. And again, work that's not only published, but also used to produce government documents. This is from the Ministry of Environment and Tourism in Namibia, and this is their document for wildlife corridors, a strategy for their maintenance and socioeconomic development and dealing with human wildlife conflict. So what we're trying to demonstrate here is that we're making the linkages between the policy documents, strategy documents, how we then manage it based on good evidence-led and science-based approaches to the work we're trying to do. Out of this arises the KAZA corridor policy brief. Corridors Connectivity Policy Brief, which is a document approved at the highest political structures within KAZA. The ministers, for example, have approved this, and this is now a document that's used to help inform how we should be addressing the problems that arise from poor connectivity and some of the solutions to dealing with those. It's an overview of current data, provides recommendations, it provides observed movements and predictive analyses, highlighting a number of areas which are important for maintaining connectivity throughout the landscape. It recognizes the threats to habitat connectivity, such as anthropogenic barriers, fences, roads, highways, and so forth, human-elephant conflict, poaching, and different kinds of land use. And again, that's reflected in a very multi-authored paper done intentionally so to demonstrate that we've got this widespread collaboration of people contributing information to what these policy documents finally provide us with.
I was just going to add to this point on the elephant movement and connectivity policy brief that, you know, it's based on the largest database on elephant movement and connectivity in the world. 4 million GPS observations, about 300 individual elephants monitored over a period of spanning more than 10 years. But it was a collaborative effort. And moving on, when we're talking connectivity, there are several constraints, and I'm not going to speak to them. But we have seen a progressive change in terms of the deepening and expansion of our knowledge and skills to actually work within this space of connectivity. Just to illustrate the point, this map that you're seeing was developed by experts. Russell was one of those. It was long before my time. But this is what they came up with in the landscape around 2011, 2012, just to illustrate the constraints. But again, sharing with you this map that Russell already spoke to, which is showing you, which is an output of the elephant survey. We are seeing and we're able to interface data related to distribution and abundance of elephants, livestock, and human activities. And of course, we've done something else in KAZA, which is a multi-species connectivity analysis, which we have not shared here. But what I'm trying to say is that there is power in being able to work together across different sectors. And the technology is beginning to enable us to do so much more innovatively. Back to the subject of veterinary fences. What I would like to mention here is that this is something that is particularly critical for us. And we made the point on this issue that veterinary cordon fences in Botswana and Namibia for a very long time have produced long-term impacts. And these impacts are related to the geographic-based approaches in the management of and controlling of veterinary diseases. And a lot of work has been done. Like what you're seeing here is basically assessments and tracking of elephant movements, male and female across the landscape, particularly Botswana and Namibia, and also the various sites that have been looked at, but also very importantly, the scientific outputs coming from this work that have been produced. The animal health sub-working group, like was mentioned earlier, is a technical working group, just like the elephants sub-working group under the conservation working group, and it comprises country veterinary and wildlife department experts, technical specialists and researchers, NGO players, and also has been supported for a very long time by the Animal and Human Health for the Environment and Development Program of Cornell University, which plays a convening role and advisory role. And then, of course, working very closely with the partner states through the KAZA Secretariat, trying to advance non-geographic disease control measures and also pushing the adoption of CBT, which I'm very glad to say was actually one of the directives of the KAZA Heads of State and Government Summit of 2024. So we have a marching order to advance this work. So what is CBT essentially? We're talking about non-geographic approach for managing animal disease risks. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the key objectives of KAZA is actually this, of basically being able to manage animal diseases through surveillance and collaboration. And then, of course, we are learning with time that this is also very important in terms of commodities such as beef derived from animals within such areas. And then, of course, the opportunities that CBT provides in terms of irrespective of disease status of the locality of production. And the concept and practice has evolved, making it ideal for integrated management of risks along value chains, especially for beef. And also to mention that it encompasses both food safety and disease risk mitigation. But we also add to this a very critical aspect of equity, being able to bring those that are structurally outside the markets to be able to market their products. Very important to mention that CBT is not a system for managing diseases like FMD. And also CBT is a process independent of the disease status of the area. And it is designed to ensure that traded animal commodities are safe in respect of sanitary risk. So just some photographs there to show you some of the work that is happening. I'm very happy to mention that with the work of AHEAD program, this CBT initiative is also something that has been elevated to the SADC level. Now, back to the KAZA-wide aerial survey of elephants and other large herbivores. I mentioned that the objective was basically threefold: abundance and distribution, to have an appreciation of that, and also to understand the carcass ratios, basically to get a sense of the impact of illegal killings. But like we mentioned earlier, this was informed by work coming back from 2019, following approval of the ministers, and also endorsed by the Kasane Elephant Summit of 2019. And we executed this survey from August to October 2022, with the objective being to provide a relatively precise and accurate estimate of the number of elephants within the landscape. Just to give you a sense of the process and what happened, we are talking of having to work with the CITES MIC aerial survey standards, and they were revised and an initial survey designed. In 2020, we began fundraising efforts, and ultimately we raised up to $3.2 million US. And this was a 2-year survey from 2021 to 2023. And of course, detailed planning had to be undertaken. We also set up a project management team comprising the Secretariat, WWF Namibia, and the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation. But very important to mention that there were other several donors. I think we had a total of 13 donors that came to the table to support the survey. And then various activities were undertaken, just like the observer training, the survey launch itself, the operations room that we had to establish, also execution, which took place from August to October. And then, of course, followed by data analysis. And we had to prepare the draft volume 2 reports, internal and external reviewed. And then, of course, the final report and launch, which took place in June 2023. The design itself had to be quite deliberate and intentional. We worked with 2 methods according to the terrain, one involving fly strips and also block counts in the hilly areas such as the Zambezi. And just to give you a sense of, what you're seeing at the bottom there is just the progress map of how the survey basically started, where the survey started and ended. And each color, what you're seeing here also on the top map there represents a stratum or sub-region of the air, and also the airports that were used for the purpose of the survey. The scale and ambition of the survey was enormous. 2 years of planning. The sample area was 312,000 kilometers squared. working in 181 strata, and this represented 99% of the KAZA elephants. But also very important to mention that there were the area is massive. If you look at the kilometers of transects that we're talking about 1.8 the size of the Earth's circumference, 8 aircraft, 700 flying hours, the amount of avgas that we had to use. I guess all I'm trying to point out here, colleagues, listeners, is that it was a collaborative effort. The partner states did not shy away from the scale of the survey. And thankfully, there was support from different partners. We had 16 survey bases, and of course, a sampling intensity of 7%, 47 staff, 50% of which came from the partner states or secondment from the government. I guess the big question is, what were the results? Nearly 230,000 elephants, plus minus 16,000. But also for Botswana, we were talking of 131,000. For Namibia, 21,000. Angola, just under 6,000. Zambia, almost 4,000. And Zimbabwe, 65,000 elephants, plus minus almost 10,000. That is just a picture of what we wanted to share with you in terms of the findings of the survey, but also very important to reflect on the issue of poaching. We know that carcasses give us an indication of the seriousness of the situation. And what you are seeing here is a depiction of the carcasses. We came up with a 10.47% estimate. And category 3 to 4, or very old, we're talking of about 25,000, and categories 1 to 2, we're talking of just above 1,000. And all elephant carcasses were just above 26,000. Now, what were the key findings? Population appeared stable. However, there was some elements of heterogeneity in elephant population trends across the landscape. High carcass ratios in some regions suggested elevated mortality. And also, this is obviously something that the partner states have been investigating over time since the survey was conducted. Because obviously the risk and pressure for poaching is high, given the sheer numbers of elephants in some parts of KAZA.
So we're back to our map again, and this is where I want to start our concluding section. Once again, we look at this overlay of elephants, livestock, and human settlement across the landscape. And how do we begin to look at this in a more focused way beyond what we've been talking about so far this evening? And I want to bring up the point that really, and sorry, here's one more slide, just to show you the abundance of wildlife and livestock across the TFCA, where positive values indicate total wildlife population estimates in green, and those of livestock are in orange. They're the more negative values. But what we are seeing is more and more livestock coming into these wildlife areas or adjacent to those wildlife areas. And really what's important is that how do we now learn to manage this, because the livestock biomass from the survey was more or less equivalent to the wildlife biomass. So you've got now equivalent amounts of livestock and wildlife occurring in the landscape. And how do we now go ahead and try and manage that? From the points that have already been raised by Nyambi in terms of livestock, connectivity, commodity-based trade, grazing, and so on and so forth. So just to move on and look at what I think we need to be really thinking about now, moving beyond the technical presentations we've been talking about so far, and to understand that KAZA is essentially a social ecological system, an SES. And these are the things we need to study, really get to come to terms with now. A social ecological system is a biogeophysical unit and its associated social actors and institutions. They are complex and adaptive and need to be adaptive. They're delimited by spatial or functional boundaries surrounding ecosystems and their own particular problem context. KAZA is such a system in which we need to consider its resilience and its adaptive capacity to change as we move on from what we've been talking about so far this evening. Managing social ecological systems, and this comes from a slide from David Cumming, who's in the audience I saw earlier on, and where we move from being in control of situations with a relatively low level of uncertainty to those situations we're finding ourselves increasingly in of greater uncertainty over which we have little or less control. So in the bottom left-hand quadrant, you've got optimal control. We are moving away from that to where we've got to think more about adaptive management, and in the top right-hand quadrant, more about things like scenario planning as we move ahead. But building on what we've already been talking about, how will elephants, for example, and other wildlife persist across the KAZA landscape in the face of poaching, for example, which is underpinned essentially by poverty and greed, poor governance and corruption, connectivity in corridors we've talked about, but which will provide an interconnected network of safe habitat for elephants, but they are threatened by permanent closure, habitat fragmentation and loss, and expanding human settlement. Agricultural development is an increasing threat, and you've seen the livestock numbers there. Veterinary cordon fences for livestock disease control measures we've discussed. We're working to get around that problem, but they're still there. And riparian infrastructure, dams and irrigation are highly attractive development issues for the agricultural sector, particularly drawing water from the Zambezi system, the Kavango, and so forth and so on. Infrastructure development that we see emerging include new roads and railway lines, power transmission lines, mineral prospecting and mining, which I think many of us are very familiar with now as an increasing threat across our landscapes in Southern Africa, not just KAZA. And of course, climate change, where we're going to experience hotter and drier periods with greater frequency of floods and droughts. Just to give you some examples of where we might be heading. This is an example from Zimbabwe where some earlier work demonstrated that at human population densities of greater than 15 people per square kilometer and or loss of more than 50% habitat is the threshold for elephants. They begin to disappear once you exceed these thresholds of around 15% people per 15 people per square kilometer and 50% habitat loss. Elephants begin to disappear, as you can see in that particular graph there. This is work based particularly on that of Richard Hall. What does that mean? What has that meant for elephants in the Zimbabwe just over the last number of years? They've actually collapsed. So between 1970 and 2020, around 2006, we began to see problems of poaching, increasing settlement, and so on. And the 2015 survey results demonstrated a collapse in that population from some 13,000 elephants to something around 3,000 now, which again was measured in the current survey that Nyambi just referred to. So these are the potential outcomes if we don't appreciate how we need to manage these systems. And post-normal science provides us with an alternative perspective to conventional species conservation plans. We need to be thinking about developing a set of future scenarios, setting timeframes for the next 20 to 30 years or longer, science-based but with a strong stakeholder participation. It's a process of assessing the likely threats to be faced and how these might be mitigated. We need to identify where spatially and temporally high coexistence and conversely high conflict situations are likely to occur, and thereafter take appropriate interventions and investments to try and avoid those negative eventualities. just to sort of embellish and emphasize that need, we need a shared vision and agreed objectives for the long-term future of elephants in KAZA. That we've achieved to a degree, but things don't stand still, they are changing constantly. So we need further stakeholder involvement, understanding, and collaboration. We need to involve key ministries, particularly those beyond Ministry of Environment, but also those involved with agriculture, lands and resettlement, and so on, and to involve them too in scenario planning, and also at the same time provide a voice for transboundary communities and seek their input. Understand and map ongoing land use planning and changes related to that, and non-natural resource related economic development activities. Scenarios for elephants may well include choice between which elephant corridors to maintain and enhance and which of those to sacrifice in this longer-term planning framework. We still need, though, nevertheless, to maintain KAZA's vision, a nature-based economy, and continue to seek convergence between policy, science, and management to avoid option foreclosure and inappropriate and irreversible natural resource decisions being made. Some lessons from KAZA that help us move ahead. Scale matters. Wide-ranging animals function at scale, which we don't always appreciate but need to understand. But we've shown by bringing together a strong collaborative group of people representing up to 100 organizations working in the landscape to commit to an agreed process. This is daunting, but substantive progress has been made, as I think we've been able to show you this evening. We need to find a balance between micro and the macro context. While we need to plan at larger scales, we need also to implement at practical, pragmatic, or feasible scales, but in the context of that bigger picture. We need to share the risk. Populations are TFC-wide residents, not just elephant populations, human populations, and connectivity, not just biological or ecological connectivity, but also that of economic connectivity and social connectivity is real and needed. We need to strengthen these wildlife dispersal areas in which people and wildlife function together, and critical to maintaining these populations. KAZA provides great opportunities to create data sets at scale and over time. And this cannot be achieved working in isolation. And we're very busy doing that, as I think has already been demonstrated. Some concluding remarks. And this comes back from, we've brought in these slides because it reflects some of the discussions that have been held in previous meetings of this group on elephant management. And it's in the eye of the beholder in space and time. And that changes. And we need to understand that it does change, as I'm going to show you now. Sorry. Oh, yeah. What does society want? And who is society? In conservation, societal needs are based largely on value judgments. Science can inform policy and likewise management, but policy shifts do take place based on value judgments often. And these value judgments drive conservation agendas and they change over time. Ideally, they're reflected in country policy and laws enacted through a parliamentary process in what we commonly understand to be a normal democratic processes. But these processes can be thwarted by both the state and society. And we need to ask the question, which society we're talking about? The community of conservation biologists, an international tourism community obsessed with cameras, elephants, and lions, citizens of the Southern African elephant range states. Which citizens? Urban, rural, both, or neither? The global conservation community. How is this best achieved? We have worked and we continue to work with participatory processes, but they are complicated, and representative processes have not been awfully successful so far. What other means are there to understand how we address this problem of what society wants and make appropriate decisions? It is not easy. So finally, we'd like to conclude in our view that in Southern Africa, elephant management needs to be politically possible, institutionally doable, socially acceptable, technically feasible, ecologically sustainable, economically viable. This is no trivial task to try and achieve that, but it's something we have to endeavor to work at. And we may find there'll be imbalances in that, and one will be weighed more heavily than the other, but it's something we need to bear in mind. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion. Thank you very much. Please briefly just acknowledge the number of people who've worked in what we've been able to show you this evening. Numerous people, institutions, and organizations have played important roles, either as actors or as stakeholders. In particular, the Secretariat, the KAZA Elephant and Animal Health sub-working groups, and their membership have played a crucial role in facilitating, collaborating, and coordinating work of this nature. Support has come from the 5 partner states in KAZA and a number of their supporting NGOs in Angola, MBAC, Panthera, Botswana, Department of Wildlife and National Parks, EcoZist, in Namibia, the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, Kwandu Carnivore Project, WWF in Zambia, Department of National Parks and Wildlife, Elephant Connections in Zimbabwe, Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, CNRS, Connected Conservation, Wilderness Trust, and others. And of course, the Departments of Veterinary Services in each country, as well as AHEAD and the Victoria Falls Wildlife Trust, who are playing an increasingly important role in providing veterinary services to the KAZA stakeholders. So thank you very much again from both Nyambi and myself.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Nyambi. At the beginning of the talk, I was considering to introduce you as 2 members of the 3 wise men, since we're close to Christmas. And looking at everything that's needed to come up with a workable elephant policy, you certainly need a miracle or 2, or a lot of luck along the way. So thank you for the work that you are doing and for the lessons learned. Somebody had to learn those lessons, and to everybody else involved in this process. This is the time of the evening to start asking questions. A lot of questions have piled up in the chat already. We'll get to them one by one, or maybe we'll try to group them together where possible. You can use the virtual tools at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand if you want to ask your question live. If you fail to do that, you can just wave at us. We'll catch you. There are 2 questions from Bruce and Brandon that I kind of want to group together. And I guess what they sort of ask you is to give a little bit of a summary of what you see the value added of KAZA is. Bruce's question is, my question is both to Russell and Nyambi, is both how much progress has KAZA made in the 14 years since it was signed to strengthen the corridors? I live just on the edge of KAZA, and I'm certain none of my neighbors are even aware that their land is included in KAZA. So and then Brandon added, I know that this might be a rhetorical question, but if sustainable development is at the core of the KAZA Treaty, what mechanisms are in place to negotiate the multitude of trade-offs? In a nutshell, how has the treaty actually curbed biodiversity loss in the area more so than if the treaty had not been established? So if it wasn't there, and if it is now there, what would have happened if it wasn't there?
Allow me to speak first. I want to say that the scale of ambition is one of the things that defines KAZA. 520,000 square kilometers from the shores of Lake Kariba right up to Quito Carnival in Angola. And I think we need to make it very clear and abundantly, for the avoidance of doubt, KAZA is not just about biodiversity conservation. Yes, everything that happens in KAZA has to be within the context of sustainable development, but KAZA is also about regional integration. How you facilitate ease movement of tourists, for example. How you harmonize vaccinations of livestock across the landscape, the promotion of climate resilience across the landscape. So one has to understand that, yes, there probably has been some challenges, but what I can tell you is that there's definitely been a lot of progress in KAZA. If you look at the KAZA TFCA Key Performance Assessment 2, look at the fact that, for example, to enable joint governance and planning, ministers have met and approved and made decisions 15 times on an average of 1 year since KAZA, once a year since KAZA was established. That is just an example. Having had the opportunity to have the KAZA Heads of State and Government Summit, first time ever, last year, and key pronouncements and commitments, reaffirmation to the KAZA vision, I think we cannot underestimate the power of political will. And we should not just be looking at biodiversity or socioeconomic advancement. Let's also look at the institutional arrangements that have been provided to support this. Everything that we spoke about in terms of the elephant survey, the animal health sub-working group or the conservation working group, that would not have been possible without KAZA. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambi. I do think that is definitely worth noting. In a time when the world seems to be tearing apart, conservation is pulling things together in this part, and that is certainly a valuable comment. Russell, would you like to add to that?
I don't think I've got much more to add to what Nyambi said, other than that I think large landscapes, and one of the reasons for TFCA is that large landscapes do confer a whole lot of social and ecological benefits that you might not find in a cohesive way when you look at individual separated protected areas. We need to link our protected areas in this social ecological type system, and it creates a whole range of economies of scale in terms of social benefits and ecological benefits.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, Wilfred, you've got your hand up. We look forward to your question.
Let me see whether I can get my camera up. Not that I'm anything to look at, but at least I'm not hiding myself. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Wilfred Pabst, known as Willie. I'm from Germany, just returned from Washington this morning, where we had the ICCF, which lots of people from Botswana and from Angola, etc., were there. The caucus is funding about $500 million worth of wetlands in Mozambique. The Mozambican president was there, etc., etc. Before that, I flew from there to there from my game reserve was in the Savi Valley Conservancy of Zimbabwe, where we had just entertained, if you can call it that, the horrific experience of a self-decided cull. We have culled elephants in total desperation because we don't know what to do anymore. 10 years we've been at it to try and find suitable places to move to. In desperation last year in in January, I offered also to WWF and all of those guys to move 400 elephants from where we are at my expense, about in a range of about 3,000 kilometers, or 3 days, which I'm told veterinary is telling me, and they are the experts, not me, that is about the maximum limit you can go to. I was called by numerous people, Willie, stop it, forget it. We are in oversupply of all these elephants wherever we go. Where I come from, we've lost 1/3 of our Mapani forest to elephants. We have probably about 95% damage to a massive array of really iconic old baobab trees. And saying all of this, when I say that in Europe here, when I'm on stage, oh, you don't like elephants? You know what? I love elephants. I love elephants. For me to stand on that stage and to shoot elephants was traumatic at best. And literally, there was quite a bit of water running down my cheeks on the first one. My question is, what are our alternatives? We have nowhere to go. The elephants are driven out, so to speak, and fenced in, I should say, because humanity is encroaching on us. It's us who are at fault, not the elephants. But I have no choice but to cull, because otherwise the whole ship is going to turn sideways or it's going to capsize. And then what we do? I've got to think of the bigger picture. We've got 2,600 counted elephants. That's probably 2,800. Carrying capacity is about 800. We talk about contraception and all the rest of it, all of that. We've investigated, makes no sense. But even if it was to make sense, I've got to get down to 800. How do I get down to 800? By not hunting. We are shooting 0.2%, 0.3% by overseas hunters who are bringing in the money that keeps the Sabi Valley Conservancy going. And that's what we're doing against a progeny of 5, 6, 7%. So it's a rounding error, if you so will. From that point of view, I do not enjoy hunting elephants, but I have had to do what we're just doing. Is there a solution? And that's my add-on to Russell. To say, sustainable utilization created the Sabi Valley Conservancy. There is no other income. I've tried tourism. 10% of our income comes from tourism, no more. And we have no choice because there is nowhere to go. We've done 9 translocations of wildlife. 2 of those were elephants. We have no destination. National Parks tells us, Willie, you have to go and cull because we cannot help you.
Thank you, Wilfred. Nyambe, Russell, that puts you on a terrible spot. What I would like to suggest, Wilfred, if you would like to watch the other episodes in the series of talks that might offer you a little bit more context and insight. I do not have, unfortunately, a solution for you right out of hand. Wilfred, Russell, Nyambe, would you like to comment?
Nyambe, start.
Maybe Russell go first, and then I'll come after you. Thank you.
Well, all I can say, and I understand Willie's dilemma very well. I understand it perfectly. TFCAs, and Nyambe referred to it in our presentation, does provide some space for additional elephants, but not necessarily yours, Willie, because we want to see some elephants in Botswana move into Angola, which is why we'd like to see some of these fences come down, which would allow locally overpopulated areas to perhaps move to less populated areas in southwest Zambia, southeast Angola. And even then again, there'll still be limited space. So we are running out of room for these elephants. And it is a conundrum that we are all having to face as time goes on. Nyambe.
If I may chime in here, I think Russell made the point during the presentation that KAZA is a socio-ecological landscape. And yes, we have socio-economic realities at play constantly. And we have ecological realities. And Willie has just explained that. If you come to parts of KAZA today, you go to Linyanti here in Botswana, you'll be disturbed by the level of degradation, just the banks of the Chobe River. So,
yep.
Colleagues, this plays out differently in different areas. And again, our appeal is let's look at the systems, let's look at the bigger picture. KAZA was established within that context of the bigger picture. The scale of ambition, I want to repeat this, 520,000 square kilometers, 90 national parks. You're talking of 85 forest reserves, which facilitate connectivity. But this is an area which is not empty. 3 million people. How do we balance this? And what alternatives do we have? Thank you.
On the topic of the people in the landscape, Bruce also, and you referred to your, in your presentation to the presence of livestock in the landscape. Does the influx of livestock mean that, or did that mean a reduction in wildlife? Or are these two components living next to each other, or is it not clear at the moment?
I'll speak briefly on this. Russell is an expert on the subject, but what I want to say is that we learned quite immensely from the aerial survey, in the sense that what we saw was that the population of the different wildlife species captured during the survey, that is elephants and other large herbivores, and livestock, shorts, cattle, everything put together, donkeys, they were almost approaching parity.
Okay.
People, that for me is something that we need to think about. What does it mean in terms of competition for forage? What does it mean in terms of competition for space? But Russell, maybe you can speak more to this.
Well, I think we've pointed out there is this growing dilemma, and we're seeing the separation out in space and probably time as well between people, livestock, and wildlife. But they do mix. There are elements. There are places where you will find livestock, people, and wildlife, including elephants, together, and that's where we are striving to seek coexistence solutions. How do people live with wildlife without wanting to destroy it? How can they benefit from it? Not necessarily just through hunting. There are other forms of livelihood measures that can be adopted, tourism being one of them, payments for ecosystem services and the like, paying people to keep out of corridors and respect them. And that's a benefit for them so that wildlife can move and to keep their cattle out. It's a complicated and complex situation, but one that's not without solutions. And that's what we're striving to find. I mean, for example, I'll speak to Herding for Health. There's a growing program, particularly in Botswana, where it's being embraced at a national level as a way of dealing with livestock numbers and overgrazing, improving animal health so that animals can be slaughtered and not just kept as wealth. They can go into commodity-based trade, for example. But these are things that do take time. And I suppose one of the dilemmas we have is that these are all processes that are time-consuming, don't happen quickly. And the meanwhile, we're losing ground in the sense that we've already heard too many people, too much livestock, growing elephant populations. It is a conundrum, and it's not easy, but I think we've tried to demonstrate that there are solutions, that things are happening.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Neil, Bruce, I see your hands are up. I would just like to ask everybody that follows, please try and keep your questions below 2 minutes and come to the question as soon as possible, because there will be a lot of discussion and I want to give everybody a chance to participate. Bruce, I'm going to move on to your question, please.
Evening, Russell, Nyambe. Wonderful to hear the presentations, but listening to you guys, it strikes me that the TFCA is now at a critical juncture where we probably do need quite a lot of money spent on resources for additional research and monitoring. You mentioned the counts that were necessary, and Russell, you highlighted how the interaction with people created stresses in the population. I think probably quite a few people know that elephants are moving south out of the TFCA towards the Limpopo through Botswana. There have been a fair number over the last couple of years that have moved south, and one supposes that they're moving kind of east and west and north as well in response to probably human pressures. My question is this. We know that it is possible for humans and elephants to coexist in a situation like this. There are good examples in Tanzania and various other places where people with cattle in rural environments can live with wildlife without any stress. It's a difficult kind of thing, as Russell pointed out, to kind of get going. It requires education and it requires the right kind of setting. So my question, Russell, is this. We we've plotted the numbers of elephants, the distribution of people, and the distribution of cattle. One supposes that things like water distribution and vegetation types and all the other ecological factors are mapped out. But how often do we need to do this? How often do we need to update human numbers and elephant numbers to ensure that we have a handle on the stresses between people and elephants? And then do we not also need to look at other stresses? There's not a perfect relationship between human numbers and cattle numbers and stress on elephants. Sometimes you can have quite high cattle numbers and quite high people densities if there's sufficient food for everyone and water and the right configuration and so on. Should we not be looking at other measures of stress to figure out how to get coexistence going? As you pointed out, Russell, it's a very, very complex problem, but I think we're at a juncture where we need to address the situation and get data for it, because if it is done nicely and properly, it will be a first and a very, very valuable bit of information on how to do the thing properly. Give it over. I don't know who wants to reply or.
I'll give it a go. Bruce, nice to see you. Thanks for your question. Haven't seen you for a while.
Yeah, hi, Russ.
In terms of counting elephants, and I'll come on to the people in the livestock in a moment, we need to count elephants probably only every 5 to 7 years, because we know their growth rate is between 3 to 4% on an annual basis, and our aerial surveys won't detect that change if we can't get our confidence limits lower than that growth rate. And the best we achieved for KAZA, which was actually very good, we got a 7% confidence limit around that estimate that Nyambi showed you. So we were very happy with that, but it's not enough to tell you whether your population is growing or not. So we only tend to count elephants from that perspective every, say, 4 to 5, even 5 to 7 years, to get some meaningful indication of trend, if trend is what you're trying to monitor. And I think trend is what one of our objectives, to see what these populations are doing. So that's part, I hope that's answered part of your question. I think looking for other stress factors is important. And I think Sam touched on this in his talk a few weeks ago, where he discussed different ways of how you measure these sorts of things. One of the things we are observing, and you referred to it, how elephants are moving south in Botswana. As you probably know, elephants have not been seen in central Kalahari for a long time, until very recently. I think while we were doing the aerial survey planning, the Botswana department picked up the first evidence of elephants in central Kalahari. Likewise, they're moving gradually towards places like Plumtree and Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe itself, they're moving south out of Wankie, down to Shangani, and so on. And they're moving amongst people and cattle and commercial farmland. So is that a stress they're responding to? And I think we need to figure that out. Is it stress, or is it because we're not doing anything about them? Are they being stressed because there may be too many elephants where they're coming from? Is it a population density regulation mechanism that's at play? I don't know those questions, but I think answers to those. But I think these are questions we should be asking. Why are those elephants moving, and what's causing that? So I don't know if that helps answer partly your question, but I think that's something we need to be looking at. And I think your point is very valid. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I also want to just turn to a question by Andre de Georges, who is always and consistently campaigning for the rights of indigenous people to be part of sustainable harvesting in terms of bushmeat consumption in protected areas. And he's asking if there is a mechanism for them to be part of the protected area and to benefit in that sense from the protected area in KAZA, or protected areas.
Okay, maybe I could speak to that, and maybe with a very specific example. And thank you for the question. If you go to Namibia, the Karamatan Association is an excellent example of a deliberate government policy to make sure that the protected area management efforts are inclusive of indigenous communities. And the Karamatan Association is actually benefiting quite a lot from the sustainable management and utilization of wildlife in the national park. And I think I can only agree with the question that we really need to do more in that regard to ensure that indigenous communities are not excluded in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
I would just echo Yambi's comment. I'll just echo his comments. I think Babwata National Park, its declaration was a very bold move by the Namibian government, where they recognized that the traditional indigenous society should continue living in what is now a national park, and they continue to reside there. And as Nyambi mentioned, they have an association which benefits from their wildlife in various different ways. So I think it was an important and a bold move by the Namibian government at the time. Caprivi Game Reserve was turned into Babwata National Park.
Thank you very much. There are a lot of questions in the chat at the moment. There's a question from JJ van Altina that's asking, do you know what the cause of deaths were in the carcasses detecting during the census? It was mentioned some of these were poaching, but curious to know if it was explored further.
Yambi, do you want to take that, or do you want me to go ahead?
Please go ahead, Russell.
We do know that at the time of the survey, or just before, there was that dive of around 300 elephants, and I stand to be corrected, in the panhandle in Botswana, which at this point in time was assumed to be, or diagnosed to be, a bacterial cyanobacteria. Yeah, cyanobacteria. More work since then in Zimbabwe by Victoria Falls Wildlife Trust. Dr. Chris Foggan identified a Pasteurella bacterium in elephants in the forest areas, which may also be linked to that incident in Botswana. But I think the jury is still out on the extent that might be the case. But those were certainly elephants that died from we think a plant-based poison or something similar.
Okay, very interesting. Wilfred, you're welcome to unmute.
There was an earlier point about cattle, livestock. On our western boundary, we now have our villagers coming in. They want to join the Conservancy because livestock is no longer possible. Climate change is hitting us hard. Within the Conservancy, we lost about, in the northern part, 80% of our grazing in the last 22 years. That has largely also to do with elephants and the way elephants literally rip out grass, including the roots. This is a horrible thing, unfortunately, as much as I love them. So the livestock scenario settles itself. Our villagers don't want to do that anymore. The only way they can feed themselves is by joining us, and that is what's called the wildlife economy. Just as an education from our side. It's easier to do, Russell, because we're 240,000 active hectares all in all. It's a little different to, my own property is about 600 square kilometers, which is about 1% of KAZA. So we're talking about very different sizes here, and it's more controllable. But it is a perfect example for everybody I talk to. I talked to the Minister of Angola. Of course, they would love to have our elephants, but you pointed out quite correctly, we're far too far away. Much better opportunities for Botswana nearby, where I was also recently. We should be going to Mozambique. They don't want them because they're scared of the elephant-wildlife conflict. We're calling. Am I happy about it? I'm absolutely disgusted that I have to do that. But it is what we have to do. We have to look at the bigger picture. We are here to keep the whole and not just one species happy. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the only solution. I wish any one of you could give me another solution. Last one, CITES. I've proposed at CITES several times, and I go there on behalf of my other organization. We have diplomatic status, raise my hand, 2,500 people. I don't understand why I4 behind me or Born Free say we shouldn't be allowing the hunting of 0.2, 0.3% of our elephants. When we have about 200,000 elephants too many in Africa south of the equator, we should be creating new national parks. We should be creating new private conservancies. There's plenty of land available where livestock cannot live, but wildlife can. You think there was one answer from 2,500 people? Flew to Geneva and chewed out the Secretary General, who said, well, you don't need to chew me out. I totally agree with you, but my members are not interested. Now what do we do? Anyway, end of my story. I can carry on for hours.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. I just want to go to Bruce's question first. Russell, how do Russell, yeah, he's directing the question to you. How do power lines affect wildlife? I would have thought that once they are built, the impact is minimal, especially compared to other impacts that you mentioned.
That's a good point. I'm not. I think what I'm addressing is this is infrastructural development that can be problematic for wildlife. I know that elephants can live with power lines. We have elephants that browse and graze underneath the Kariba power lines every day at Kariba. It's not a problem for them, but I think transmission lines like that do destroy habitat. And if you take a place like Zambezi region in Namibia, the former Caprivi Strip, which, as you know, is a very narrow strip of land, you put a railway line along that and power lines along that, you are really disturbing a lot of habitat, which will affect wildlife, I think. So I don't think we can discount the impacts of power lines totally. I think that it's probably a minimal impact, but it will have some impact in a narrow space of land like the Zambezi region, that narrow strip of land. And I say that because Zambezi region in Namibia is pivotal to connectivity across the rest of KAZA. If that strip of land becomes a total barrier because of infrastructure development, you will have no connectivity from Botswana into Angola or into Zambia. So I think that's the reasons we've put in things like that kind of infrastructural development, and add to that irrigation schemes in the same area, in that same region, because again, Zambezi region in Namibia is seen as Namibia's breadbasket. That's where they get the most rainfall and where people want to grow crops. So bring in irrigation, infrastructure like power lines and a railway line, all of a sudden you're left with no connectivity. So that's why those points are made there. Thank you.
If I may just Abraham. Yeah,
yep, please.
I think we should not just limit our understanding of the impacts of power lines to, in the physical sense, the unintended consequences of infrastructure development, be it power lines, rail lines, roads, in terms of making previously difficult to access areas now easily accessible, and what that means because for wildlife and biodiversity in general. So I think it's also very important that we really pay particular attention to the unintended consequences of policies for infrastructure development. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess this is the question. What is really sustainable development? We also want communities to have the same privileges that we have while we conserve wildlife. Gustav, please unmute to ask your question. I would like to just point out that we need to start wrapping up. Our two guest experts have been with us for almost 2 hours now, so it's been running long.
Can we hear Holly's question? Can we have Holly's question?
Yes, I absolutely do want to have Holly's question. So yes, Gustav, please go ahead. Gustav, if you could just unmute, please.
Good evening.
There
My question, I think Bruce alluded to it to the chat, and it kind of got lost in there. I just wanted to know, someone referred to if we can improve agriculture. There was a number quoted from maize yields of 1.5 tons, which is the communal average that was quoted, to 6 tons. Someone mentioned, will that worsen the human-wildlife conflict, or will it in fact improve it by reducing and taking pressures off the conservation area? So is it a catch-22, or do we think if we improve, whether it be through conservation agriculture, regenerative or sustainable agriculture, or will it in fact worsen the problem by increasing human populations even more? So it's just, yeah, I just wanted to ask that. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, let me give it a shot. I think it's important to, first of all, acknowledge the fact that KAZA is largely an arid area, and productivity levels for certain crops like maize is on the lower end. So being able to promote agroecological practices like conservation agriculture is a strategy that we are pursuing with different partners. Some of the measures that we are implementing include cluster farming, being able to work with communities so that they invest in, they're supported in farming within these cluster fences and smaller fields but higher yields. And also very important to mention that where you locate your farms or your fields is also very important in as far as human-wildlife conflict is concerned. So being able to locate these fields outside known corridors. And of course, we also are investing quite a lot with the partner states in active measures to manage human-wildlife conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Nyambe. Russell?
I've got one question to Nick. Your yields are very interesting. They're very high. I've got yields of 5,000 kgs from conservation agriculture, agroecology. It's quite a bit lower than those you mentioned. And I think we can achieve 5,000 kgs per hectare in these areas, but that's a pretty good yield for these sandfelt low rainfall areas in KAZA. So that's from southwest Zambia, that particular figure.
Thanks, Russell. That's definitely a further area to explore. Let's go to Holly.
Thanks, Johan. And I'm quite sure my two colleagues there are not too worried about any questions from me that would be hard to handle. So maybe I'll just give a little bit of a comment, and thanks for tolerating it at this late hour, both Nyambe and Russell. So just to follow up, Nyambe, on a couple things you said, just some very short things. Unintended consequences, and it is complicated. That's an interesting kind of thing, because as humans, one of the things we have that other species don't have is supposedly our brains and our ability for reasoning. Apparently, we really suck at it, even though we have that ability. So we're not very good, and we try. And I would like to just comment before a couple of other things and then a question, which is I think many of us have been on the other calls. We've been on many other webinars. When we say complicated, sometimes we're talking about just one little site. Sometimes we're talking about a couple of sites in a country. In this case, we're talking about 5 countries and a lot of sites. And I think that people, some of the things I've heard here, I don't think people probably have a lot of experience with that, because I think a lot of the views are quite naive in what they think is possible. We talked here about, people were throwing out, and in a good way, suggestions. Why don't we this? Why don't we that? I just want to start with talking just a moment about elephant translocations. So there are a group of people, Richard Hoare is involved, and other people, who've been trying to look at what the outcomes of all of these elephant translocations have been. It's very difficult to do that, much more difficult than you would think, because out of all the attempts, only one of the translocations that we've tried to look into was actually willing to give any data about what happened after the translocation to people or to elephants. So while there's a lot of fanfare about let's translocate and let's get it going and let's move this many and let's move them 3,000 and let's move them, yeah, well, where we do know about the outcomes, they have not been good generally for elephants or for people. So I really caution us on that's how we're going to solve everything, is we're going to get over the problem and we're going to translocate them. And it's very much related to also the idea of expanding protected areas. Well, maybe, but on what land? Well, maybe there's a lot of land, but what I've seen is a lot of translocation plans call something an elephant area or a free area, and don't seem to have actually done any of the mapping of the human settlements in those areas. So off go some elephants right into another area or a new protected area, more problems. So you can see that we do wonder about humans and our ability to actually think these things out. They're very complicated. And to come on, Nyambe, and I wanted to follow up on this just to make a quick comment, Bruce, about Tanzania and the pastoralists living with wildlife. I work in Tanzania quite a bit. There's amazing problems of human-wildlife conflict there with the pastoralists. They are very much more tolerant for reasons we don't have time to discuss, but they have the government under incredible pressure. And if you look tonight at what's going on in the news in Tanzania around the elections, some of that is around wildlife and around how the government has maybe not dealt with human-wildlife conflict very well. So there's no place that's really immune that I know of, and I know quite a few places. So when we talk about corridors, I think it's important for people to know that not only are wildlife corridors under planning, but on the continent now that are under full planning. And when I say full planning, I mean the governments have every intention of putting these corridors in, and they're huge. And they're right in areas where people would think are wildlife corridors. So everybody's planning for corridors. And I think that we just have to start being realistic that we can't have it all. And I think where Nyambe was talking about conservation being a social construct, pretty much everything humans do is a social construct. That's what makes us human. We do social constructs, many of them. So, I think if we're looking now, and I know, Nyambe, you touched on it a little bit, but I'd just like to know what you both feel is the best way. You work with 5 governments. I work with a lot of governments too, but you work with 5 very intensively. And to me, this question about the cross-sectoral needs, let's just say it's in a development corridor. Let's say it's in KAZA. It doesn't really matter. KAZA is probably part of one of the big development corridors because of the river and the water systems there. So what will these governments be looking at? My understanding is that the ministry that deals with water will be looking at water needs for the country or for those areas. The ministry that deals with agriculture will be looking at agricultural food needs of the country, food security. The infrastructure people will be looking at how to move things from A to B to C. The minerals people will be looking at how they get cash. So everybody's got a job to do, and they're all in the same government. So what would you guys suggest would be the best ways through this, which is that wildlife, if I hate to be so brutal, but generally wildlife is not a ministry. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's a department. But let's just face it, it's not a line ministry. So it's usually not in an exceedingly powerful position in any country, even the countries where tourism is a big factor. It still is not one of the driving ministries. So wildlife is there trying to make its case. So I'd just like to know from, the two of you, how do we get at that? Because that's just a battle over land. So in my view, land is what the issue is. The whole thing is about land. And there are shortages of land where people want to live and where people can live. So what would you guys suggest are good ways forward for that? KAZA being a wonderful sort of melting pot and opportunity for us to try out these things. I know you've tried many, but what ways are we going to go forward to I wouldn't think trying to make wildlife competitive per se, but at least for wildlife to get on the table with all those other ministries and their needs. How should we do that? So I'll leave you guys with that question, and thanks so much for all your answers to up until now.
Thank you, Holly. I think that's about the question to end all questions.
Okay, thank you, Holly, for that question. I just want to begin by quoting the second objective. What I presented were paraphrased, so maybe it wasn't very clear. The second objective, as articulated in the KAZA treaty, reads, to promote and facilitate the development of a complementary network of protected areas within the KAZA TFCA, linked through corridors to safeguard the welfare and continued existence of migratory wildlife species. Partner states have committed themselves to this, and the question is, what is being done? One of the marching orders from the last summit was to work across sectors, integrated development planning. This February, for the first time, we were able to meet with land use planners from the countries, and we're going to continue because this is something that we need to do. We've experimented in the past. When I say we, I mean the wildlife sector, experimented in the past working as wildlife experts. But when the rubber hits the road, you have not involved the key ministries, local government authorities, and others to actually legally protect those wildlife corridors, or also give them the social stamp of approval, because these are areas outside. For example, in some instances, there are areas within communal lands. How do you manage to do that? So it's really about working with everybody at different levels and advancing the agenda of cross-sectoral collaboration and integrated development planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambe. Russell, last word from you.
No, I think Nyambe's got it, and Holly's questions are very good, and I think we understand them. Yeah, I think Nyambe's given the right kind of response. We've got to understand the governments we're working with and learn how to work across the sectors and also from top to bottom, so to speak, which has already been alluded to. Thanks.
Thank you to you both. Thank you so much for your time and answering the questions as comprehensively as possible. In terms of the suggestions for a forum or an event to look into the sustainable use of wildlife, we've done extensive work with the Africa Wildlife Economy Institute related to the University of Stellenbosch, and we will keep on doing it, and we will meet with them soon to plan for more events. We've hosted just about exactly this time last year in a 2-3 day colloquium with them. And if you head over to the link that Maret just posted in the chat, you will find all that content there that deals with all the issues that were discussed there, from a very practical level to a high level policy level. So there's a lot of that for you to delve into in the meantime. Thank you to all of you. Please join us on the 13th of November. Next week, we will take a break, and hopefully some of us will enjoy some elephants in the meantime. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely evening.